Is it started? Yes. The chapter that we are studying, the chapter that we are studying, the evolution of the spiritual man, is of crucial importance because Sri Aurobindo describes here not only how the spiritual consciousness emerges out of the mental, but also what are the different ways in which this emergence takes place? What are the stages of these different ways that nature has already worked upon, where it has brought us and where it has to lead? It's a complete roadmap of the spiritual emergence out of mind. And in this, there is a historical perspective looking back. There is a natural perspective looking around, because the final driver of evolution so far has always been nature herself. And then there is the forward look to what needs to be done now to take charge of this movement and or accelerate it. It encapsulates the whole journey to spirit. Here, he has shown us already that there is a struggle between the spiritual emergence and the limitation of our instrumental nature. The two have to constantly support each other. And now he moves to the lines of development that nature has utilized to assist the consciousness living in the surface mind to begin a deepening process, to learn to go within. so that this superficial nature and the soul's effort from within can join. There is no spirituality if there is not first some degree of an interiorization that allows access to some experience of the spirit. And he points out that nature has actually used 4 main lines to open up the inner being. These lines we have seen are religion, occultism, spiritual thought, and inner spiritual realization and experience. The first 3 are approaches, he says, and it is the last, the spiritual realization and experience, which is the decisive avenue of entry. Entry towards what? Towards the inner ranges, where the real journey begins and where the real emergence of the spirit can take place. The 4 powers or the 4 lines of development have each assisted each other, sometimes conflicted, gone against each other. He described in detail the role of religion, the role of occultism, spiritual thought, and last we paused at his description of the direct spiritual experience. And spiritual experience, he says, has used all the 3 means as a starting point, but it has also dispensed with them, relying on its own pure strength. We saw last time the sense of what is pure strength of spiritual experience. Unlike religion, occultism, or spiritual thought, which depend on some secondary power of our nature, the pure experience has its own conviction, which even when questioned by these other powers can stand on its own. Whereas those other 3 can make any progress, but you can question them, question their validity, and they do not have what is needed within to justify. So of all 4, the most powerful, of course, is spiritual experience, and its strength is pure, not relying on anything else, inherent. But it has also dispensed with them all, relying on its own pure strength, discouraging occult knowledge and powers as dangerous lures and entangling obstacles. It has sought only the pure truth of the spirit. We have seen already many examples of how occult approaches to the spirit can be helpful up to a point, but more often than not, the very means they use and the reliance on intermediate powers tends to distract from the real purpose, the real spiritual focus. And the moment one gets powers, the first thing that happens is the ego gets exaggerated. It is the ego that seizes the power. It never has a chance to be freed from its own limitations by a higher spiritual realization. And so, in the proper sequence of things, the spiritual awakening must come first, to whatever extent possible, and then it can turn upon these inferior powers, including occult powers, and take them up from a liberated poise. But passing through occult knowledge as a means inevitably involves some such distraction or entangling. Next, as regards spiritual philosophy, he says, dispensing with philosophy, it has arrived instead through the heart's fervor or a mystic inward spiritualization. The philosophy, if you begin with it, would inevitably bind you in the rationale of the philosophy, in the very process of thought. And the moment the consciousness begins to go beyond it and begins to touch the spirit directly, the philosophy will kick in and say, but that's not how it's supposed to be. It has to happen this way and not that way. Am I imagining things? Or am I going the wrong way? Is this correct? Is this... It can question unendingly, but more importantly, in the very entry through philosophy, the higher experience is bound to an idea. And even as an experience can fill, the mind seizes on the idea which it has held on for so long and says, this is it, rather than transcending the idea into pure experience. In fact, one of the most common kinds of experience that comes is a sudden stoppage of thought, or a certain sudden dissolution of narrowness, both of which, to one who has entered through philosophy, feel as if the mind is becoming stupid. I cannot think, or I'm going to die. And so it stops the experience and goes back to the safe thought forms of the philosophy. Sri Aurobindo narrates how in one of the in the early days, somebody came to him and asked him for the experience of silent mind. And Sri Aurobindo said to him, sit down, and he continued reading his newspaper. Obviously, he put the pressure of his consciousness on the person, silencing his mind. And within a few minutes, the person jumped up and said, I'm going mad, and ran away. What was his fear? Going mad? He couldn't think anymore. And in the imprint of that silence, his instinct was to try to think harder. What's happening? I cannot think. And that's the habit of the philosophy. And somehow philosophy, approaching spirit, thinks that by philosophizing more, it will get closer. But in fact, it goes the other way. Or maybe you will recall the experience I had narrated, I think it was here, of someone who, experiencing an intense descent of the presence, suddenly stopped the experience, and she said, it was too intense and I thought it's a contraindication that I should not take it on. And where is this contraindication thought? From some reading, from some study, which is always saying the path should be like this, and if this happens, well, whatever the thought process, it gave her a perspective that could not comprehend that which is beyond these limits and definitions. So, when the pure spiritual experience dispenses with philosophy, what does it use instead? The heart's fervor or a mystic inward spiritualization. Either it leans on the bhakti movement and the heart giving itself and the intensity of that which leads to the communion and closeness with the divine presence, or there is a kind of a spontaneous inward turn and you feel something and you continue to deepen in it. And this is what he describes as mystic inward spiritualization. And then in relation to religion, he says, putting behind it all religious creed, worship and practice, and regarding them as an inferior stage or first approach, it has passed on, leaving behind it all these supports, nude of all these trappings, to the sheer contact of the spiritual reality, capital R. So again, in the experience itself, when first an experience is had, you recognize how petty and hollow the religious forms, worships, beliefs are. When somebody picks up a book and says, this is my way to God, you look at him and you say, yes, okay, if it helps you. Or if it is a creed that says, this is the only way, there is no other way. Someone else says, unless I spin my flame 3 times, or unless I repeat my mantra 108 or 1008 times, I cannot get to God. One again wonders at how silly or childish it seems. But all of these may be helpful at a certain stage, but the pure experience, having once had a contact, can easily and rapidly drop these. leaving behind it all these supports. So he's now going to use several words: supports, trappings, and first approaches. So when you first approach, something is helpful. I sit down in the early morning when I wake up, and it is the best time when there is nothing distracting me. Perhaps my mind is fresh or it's sleepy, whatever the cause. And at that moment, it's an aid because there are no thought forms. There is no confusion in the atmosphere to pull your mind or distract your energies. It's an aid. But to say that you can only realize the divine by waking up early in the morning is again silly. So, first approaches, supports. As you proceed, you have an experience, but you can't hold the experience, and you need these as a support. Knowing that this is not what gives the experience, but somehow it helps me to hold or to enter in alignment. People often use pictures, visualizations, and if they don't make the mistake of clinging to the picture itself, it's fine. You visualize an image, a form of deity within your heart or in front of you or above you, and that helps your heart's devotion to rise and open. It helps to make that first approach, and then at some point you have to recognize that the divine cannot be bound in a few lines of sketch or even a photograph or even a memory. The memory you have of a contact with the divine in human form or even in subtle form is still a little vehicle, and you are entering through that vehicle to meet the infinite, who transcends all forms but who fills equally all forms. And at some point you have to let go these favorite forms, their supports, and what remains then as your means? Nude of all these trappings. The suggestion in the very wording of the nude, you see, we use clothings, coverings for ourselves, but also as perceptions for the divine. If you look at any theater or cinema where there is a meeting with the divine, it comes in a human form. Why not that it comes in an animal form or a bird form? And we do have some of the traditions, old traditions, cultures where God is seen also through some of those forms or some half human, half animal forms. But the need for a form is always blocking and preventing, and equally for us, the need for some part in us to be the link point is also a trapping. So, nude of all these trappings, let's go of all our methods as well as of all coverings of the divine. And the image that comes spontaneously associated with this mood is of someone utterly bare, in a consciousness that is utterly bare, and the picture that would come is someone in the peaks of the mountains, freed of all things which would bind. And this was the idea of those who sought pure spiritual experience by abolishing all such limitations to the sheer contact of the spiritual reality, only that and nothing else. The sages or individuals who seek this kind of thing, direct, pure, bare contact, are very few. And they can also reach that having passed through the intermediate stages of these first approaches, supports, and trappings. But at some point, if this work has been done in earlier lives, one seems to be able to make that leap. But if you look at evolution as a whole and humanity as a whole, all those earlier stages are even necessary. All these variations, Sri Aurobindo says, were necessary. The evolutionary endeavor of nature has experimented on all lines in order to find her true way and her whole way towards the supreme consciousness and the integral knowledge. Now again we come to a critical aspect of the whole journey. Who has been making the journey? It is nature. Conscious or semi-conscious or even unconscious. But in nature's journey, she does not know which is the best way, or she does not know how to combine the different ways or the different aspects of the way, because she wants an integral knowledge to lead to that one supreme. But the knowledge of the supreme should be integral, it should include all aspects. And so she has to experiment, try a little bit of that, try a little bit of that, make variations within these, and taking these four broad main lines, linking them, combining them in different ways. And what we realize is at different stages of human evolution, some of these are more helpful, at other stages, others are more helpful. So many human beings take to the spiritual life because first they were attracted by occultism. I want to have that power to be able to solve my problem in business. And so the fellow says, what do I do? Someone says, chant this mantra. He starts his chanting. Someone starts with, my body is sick. I need to heal it. What can I do? Do this pranic practice or do those asanas and pranayam. And the fellow starts. Somewhere along the way, in the very nature of the practice, there is a momentary touch of something higher. And once that touch is had, one begins to feel that all these things, being satisfied for a while, that touch is far more deeply satisfying, and then the turn begins. The soul sometimes has a very clear sense of what it wants, but the outer personality may be confused and covered up. And the soul can nudge from within to push it to attraction of these things in order to eventually surpass them and go to the more direct realization. So in a sense, nature herself is trying to see for different human types what's the best route, what is the easiest, and what leads to the biggest, largest integration. This understanding that nature has done this is crucial for us, because in a sense our nature, whatever it may be in this lifetime, is only a narrow frontal projection of a larger nature, of which for this life the soul has taken this narrow frontal projection for a special experience, but in other lives it has taken other aspects of the nature, sometimes highlighting the aspect of strength, sometimes highlighting the aspect of knowledge, sometimes the aspect of devotion, sometimes of refinement and subtlety. And each of these has required an incarnation in a body which was more appropriately suited for that line of development. When soul has to manifest its full potentiality through the outer nature, all of those experiences developed in those lives and the essence absorbed through them will be brought out by the soul to fill a plastic nature on the surface and fill with all these qualities and capacities already developed. So when we think of nature, we should not limit ourselves to my nature in this incarnation. In a sense, we are each of one of us concerned with all human nature, because that represents as if the broad range of variations of expression in nature of our own higher possibilities and our own higher transformed nature and our own journey in the past, of course. When we struggle with certain difficulties and someone else struggles with other difficulties of their specific nature, it is silly to say that I have an advantage. In fact, you have either gone through those difficulties already of their nature in an earlier incarnation, or you will have to face them later in another incarnation, or perhaps in this very life. And in a sense, his struggle is your struggle, because unless that mastery is made, whether in him or in yourself, your nature's transformation would be incomplete. He moves to the next paragraph now, where he justifies why these four main lines. What do they really give? For each of these means or approaches corresponds to something in our total being, and therefore to something necessary to the total aim of her evolution. So this is the sense of the total being. All experiences of human types and natures are part of our total being. And in the total aim of nature's evolution, this full spectrum of four broad lines is needed. And what do they correspond to? He says, there are four necessities of man's self-expansion if he is not to remain this being of the surface ignorance, seeking obscurely after the truth of things and collecting and systematizing fragments and sections of knowledge. That's what we are, this whole description. We keep catching little pieces and trying to somehow join them, organizing them. The small, limited and half-competent creature of the cosmic force which he now is in his phenomenal nature. So it's a very disappointing view, but a very objective view. What are we finally? The force that built us is this cosmic force. And what has it created so far? Small, limited and half-competent creature. But all this limitation and half-competence is only in our surface, phenomenal nature. Deep within us, there is the all potential still waiting to organize itself. And when it tries to organize itself, it finds four necessities of man's self-expansion. That inner range, which is wide, has to now push itself into this outer narrowness to expand it. And there are four necessities there, which he now describes. He must know himself and discover and utilize all his potentialities. So there are three stages to that. First, your consciousness turning within becomes aware that there is such a thing within you. You didn't even know. But knowing is not enough. So the next part is discover. You remove the coverings and allow that thing to act. And third step is utilizing that potentiality. I didn't know that within me there was this ability to sense things of the subtle worlds. Now that I become aware that there is such a thing, well, where is it? And I start looking for it. And I remove the coverings until I discover, here is that sensitivity. I already had it. I didn't know. And now I begin to develop and apply, for example, or any of the innumerable potentialities. So he must know himself and discover and utilize all his potentialities. But to know himself and the world completely, he must go behind his own and its exterior. He must dive deep below his mental surface and the physical surface of nature. But it's not enough to find a few of these potentialities. You must have the completeness, and for that, the condition, he says, is to go deep below his own mental surface and the physical surface of nature. So the description here is actually there are stages or efforts in the yoga. The first part is going below the mental surface. Here I am thinking and I don't realize that this thought process itself is a superficial layer. To go deep behind to the thing which makes the thought process possible and to go really deep. And the other thing is surface physical nature, to which we are so tightly bound, and especially because through its senses we know the world. And we are so obsessed with knowing the world outside us through those senses that we stop with only those. The first real movement of the spiritual turn involves a disengagement from this exaggerated fixation on the surface, and a deepening. The deepening takes you behind the mind into those depths, but also behind the body. Often, when one enters the depth of it, there is almost a trance-like experience where the body becomes numb, it becomes still, it becomes quiet, and allows your consciousness now to penetrate to those ranges. And that's when you begin to realize how much there is within waiting. Literally, as we have been told, there is an entire universe within us, bigger than the universe outside us. This he can only do by knowing his inner mental, vital, physical, and psychic being, and its powers and movements, and the universal laws and processes of the occult mind and life which stand behind the material front of the universe. That is the field of occultism if we take the word in its widest significance. So now he is going to justify each of these four things, first beginning with occultism, then religion, and then the spiritual philosophy. But you can see how this very first movement of going in, what does it reveal to you? Inner mind, inner vital, inner physical, and the psychic being. These are the things which make you and the reality of you. Take those things out and you're just a robot on the surface. There is now increasingly the possibility, the capacity of our current genetic knowledge to play with life forms, to be able to build in the laboratory variations of life forms, to take an existing plasm, trigger it to become a complete fetus or a body, without actually having to go through a human womb or a normal birth process. You can make it grow inside an artificial womb in a fluid, amniotic type artificial liquid until it is ready for birth. And the question we would ask is it a conscious human being with a soul? How would you know? And in fact, this is a problem. There have been, in fact, in the past, things like this made, sometimes by occult means, sometimes by technological means. And such forms developed were treated as slaves because they were no different from machines as far as their creators were concerned. But this is the question we would ask at that point. What makes a human being truly human and not merely a machinery of biology that is living mechanically by pure life impulse? Well, we could say the fact that there is a life impulse makes it sacred. If that is the case, then every animal should be treated with the same sacredness. And you have no right to kill any animal or even to bind any animal. But we do that. So it's not life that we worship. We worship something else within which inhabits. But such a being born could learn, could be trained, could be taught, could be programmed as we program our own children through the educational system or through the media and television, and could behave like a human being quite well. How would we distinguish? And the real distinction will be if there is this inner mind, inner vital, inner physical. Well, maybe something of that might be there, but that's not enough. There has to be the psychic being. If that is not there, or if there is not something of the psychic individualizing presence, you would consider that being almost to be a robot. We are very close to that kind of technology. In fact, it has been done in many of the deep dark projects where they build human beings on demand like clones, but not born in a normal way. A clone as we know it normally is only a cell taken as a clone and then put in a womb and going through the normal birth process and would have a separate soul, not a problem. But if you take it through that other process, would there be a soul? We don't really know. I'm pointing to this as an example. Why Sri Aurobindo is highlighting this? Without this, there is not the real spiritual content of our existence. And so the very first movement to the inner mental, inner vital, inner physical and the psychic being and its powers and movements and the universal laws and processes of the occult mind and life which stand behind the material front of the universe. So as you become conscious of these things within you, you also become conscious of the same things outside you. And so you begin to see that there is an occult mind, capital M, occult life, capital L, which is part of this larger mind in the universe, a kind of a cosmic mind or a cosmic life. And it stands behind this material front of the universe. You look at the forest, and from a satellite picture you'll say, so many square kilometers of trees, and you can reduce it to a financial value. If you cut those trees and sell them, this is the money you make. But if you look from the inner sight, you see a conscious living being, of which the forest is a body. You see a conscious mind, which acts through the life force that is the forest, and it is that mind which even looks forward and chooses certain lines of its own development and creates the balance of animal life and the ecosystem and holds it. Although it seems precarious to us, the mind willing guides it and maintains it. And this we can see and we can relate to when we become conscious of our own inner mind and inner vital. And of course, if we are conscious of the inner, inmost psychic being, we are conscious of it in all things. Being conscious in it, living more and more in the psychic presence, we become also conscious of the divine presence that fills everything. And Mother says it is even possible for the psychic being to glimpse the Satchidananda purely, directly, by passing any higher stages of development of consciousness. You may not be able to embody, but you can at least glimpse and know its reality. But in all this, the spiritual component comes only when the psychic being is had. If you stop with the inner mental, inner vital, inner physical, and the occult mind and occult life behind the front of the universe, then that is just the occult knowledge. That is occultism. So the problem is the entry into the occult field and the entry into the spiritual field have common shared initial space. When an occultist tries to develop a certain power of the inner mind or inner vital, or attempts to acquire some mastery in these sheaths of the inner vital, the vital sheath or the mental sheath, and tries to develop their perceptions or actions in them, he is at the same time preparing himself for a still deeper access if he so chooses to. Equally, someone who seeks to enter deep in the experience of the psychic being or the self and begins this inward movement necessarily passes through the inner mind and inner life and acquires some awareness of the subtle body and the inner vital and the inner physical, and can sense things on those levels or even act on those things. And he may choose to ignore them, but he will still have the perception and the sensitivity and the ability to act. So this occult space is not necessarily such a big deal. It's not necessarily a problem if you keep your focus on the goal towards which you're going. So that, he says, is the field of occultism. If we take the word in its widest significance, of course its narrower significance will be doing magical practices to acquire powers using basic formulas, but that's only a very superficial part of occultism. It's like saying that you're trying to develop your mastery of the knowledge of science or mathematics by reading the tables of elements and doing basic calculations, and it stops there. But that's not science. That's just the tools of science. And in this case, the tools of occult knowledge in action might involve some particular symbolic arrangements. But they are tools. The true occult knowledge or experience is awakening to the inner mind and life and being able to wield your consciousness from there. Next, he takes up the question of religion. And you see how from the spiritual perspective, the religion or the core elements of religion inevitably come in the nature of the spiritual journey. So he says, he must know also the hidden power or powers that control the world. If there is a cosmic self or spirit or a creator, he must be able to enter into relation with it or him and be able to remain in whatever contact or communion is possible. Get into some kind of tune with the master beings of the universe, or with the universal being and its universal will, or a supreme being or his supreme will. Follow the law it gives him and the assigned or revealed aim of his life and conduct. Raise himself towards the highest height that it demands of him in his life now or in his existence hereafter. Now you have seen a whole range of things he describes. We'll have to dwell on each of those. But there's still the option, what if there's no such being? So he gives that option also. If there is no such universal or supreme spirit or being, he must know what there is and how to lift himself to it out of his present imperfection and impotence. This approach is the aim of religion. Its purpose is to link the human with the divine, and in so doing sublimate the thought and life and flesh so that they may admit the rule of the soul and spirit. So this is what we see in summary, what all those descriptions really require or lead to. There is something, call it divine. How do you link the human to that and lift your thoughts and life and body substance towards that and allow that influence to fill your thoughts and life and your body substance? This is the goal of religion. For that, there are two approaches broadly. One that says there is self, cosmic self or spirit or creator, and another that says there is no such thing, which would be in the more, let's say, Buddhist or Nirvanic approaches. He looks at both. In the first case, in general, he says, for both of these, the hidden power or powers that control the world, to recognize that in fact, behind the scene, there are powers, and some of these are large powers, capital P, that control things. The perception of these powers is also inevitable if you have had that first occult entry. So from an occult development of the inner sight, you look at the volcano and you will say, there is a being there. But if you can see that, then you look at the universe and say there is a being there. The whole universe is presided over by a consciousness or a being or spirit or self. When I was interacting with several leaders, elders of the Native American tradition, this is a question that often came up. They would often, in all their invocations, call upon the spirits, call upon the ancestors. And I remember one of them, very kind and sweet man, he did his prayers and then he said, can you feel the presence of the spirits and the ancestors? And for me it was always a problem that there was a plural involved. Spirits, ancestors, and it was a sense of a chaos of so many influences, and necessarily it felt as if it would lead to some kind of conflict, not to a union, not to a harmony which is sustained by an underlying oneness. So I approached this man and I said, do you have in your tradition the concept of one? which is beyond these spirits or ancestors? And he said, yes, we call it the Great Spirit. I said, why don't you invoke the Great Spirit? And he looked at me in a bit of a surprise, but I don't remember if he answered. But it led to other discussions, and I saw that it was there in the tradition, but somehow the focus of the tradition was more to something closer, more accessible, because it gives results also which are more specific and narrow. The Great Spirit is perhaps too great, but still it is known, it is seen. And so, if there is a cosmic self or spirit or a creator, we should be able to enter into relation with it or him. Why the it and him? Sri Aurobindo is actually touching all possible nuances of the relationship. So first, cosmic self is one way of looking at it. The whole universe has a self, just as we have a sense of self. The universe can say I and experience its own self, but it is a cosmic, embracing, all-inclusive self. Or, instead of a sense of individuality of self, it is something permeating, like a fine presence of an ether, a spirit that fills everything, and it's always there. But you don't necessarily feel it or sense it as the self of the cosmos. Or, the other approach is to view it as the one who creates the universe. Because we see in the universe a movement. A movement necessarily has an origin. And even if the origin is outside space and time, still there has to be something which originates any movement, gives to it an impetus, a will, a purpose, a direction. And so the creator. What is interesting is there is an experience where you can experience cosmic self, spirit, or creator as three aspects of the same one. That would be for us the highest poise of the divine. But if there is this, you should be able to enter into relation with it or him. In the Vedic tradition, when the divine is known in his transcendence, then it transcends all relationships, so we refer to it as it. When that transcendence turns to embrace the world, then we relate to that relationship now as him. And be able to remain in whatever contact or communion is possible. So there are systems which say you can never have contact with that because it is transcending. You can only commune. So he includes both terms. Get into some kind of tune with the master beings of the universe, or with the universal being and its universal will. So, master beings is how one begins first to recognize. These would, for example, correspond to the Vedic deities or their corresponding aspects as seen in the Greek mythological formulations, traditions, as cosmic powers which are so massive, so inclusive, that they appear to be literally the divine, but in a specialized function, specialized aspect. So to be able to enter in a kind of tuning with them, why is that necessary? Because they exist and because we are formed by them, you cannot say you are cut off from them. And if their working works in you, then you are not self-master unless you are equally aware of them or even transcend them. So somewhere in your spiritual awakening, you would eventually meet these, know them, and enter in some kind of relation with them. Or with the universal being. Instead of master beings, the universal being, as if all these master beings are aspects of the being and its universal will. If there is one being, just as the master beings have their wills, this one being has one will that fills the whole universe, guides it. And for us to be able to sense what that will is and align ourselves to it is a necessary part of the spiritual development. Or a supreme being and his supreme will. So, what's the difference between universal being and supreme being? Universal being is as if the being who is universe. Supreme being is one who presides over universe. So, again, these are different stages of relationship with the divine. All these are included in the journey. Follow the law it gives him. Why would you want to follow the law it gives you? Why not you say, I will follow my law, who are you to dictate? The question, of course, is relevant if that being is another. So if somebody comes in the middle of the market and says, you should follow my law, I say, no thank you, I will follow my law. But if in my awakening I discover there is this greater consciousness that is me, that is more truly me than even this which I call me, and it has already chosen a certain movement of manifestation, then I cannot but say, well, this is what I chose. And so when it says, this is your purpose in life, I cannot say, why are you dictating to me? Because I am the one who has chosen this. And I say, yes, now I remember this is what I chose, and I follow. That is this narrow surface personality which always felt itself separate, when it discovers itself a part of that, now willingly accepts. But it must know in order to be able to consciously participate in the work, in the play. So, follow the law it gives him and the assigned or revealed aim of his life and conduct. So, first aspect is law. Second aspect is your aim in life and your conduct in life. So, the law is something much more general. This is what you will see in religions, particularly in the Abrahamic religions, the sense of a law which is revealed by a revealer, by a prophet, or by a book. And the law formulates the form in which your life has to be expressed to put it in right relation with the divine will. Of course, the moment you've articulated it in such terms, it becomes a travesty of the divine will and inevitably leads to other problems. But the same concept exists in the Vedantic as well as in the Buddhist tradition with the word dharma, in which the sense of law is much more essential, that there is something which is already intended or willed which forms the whole universe, and because it is the way the universe unfolds, it's the movement of natural growth. So it's not something which I have to translate and understand by mind, it's rather something I have to feel as the most natural movement of my development and flow with it. It's the same idea you will find in the Chinese tradition, in the Tao. The Tao, we are taught, cannot be spoken of. In the very act of speaking it, you have lost it. And when you cannot formulate it, then you have it. But it's the same idea of the movement of the will of the divine unfolding. And if you give to it a form of words, you have already lost it. But if you stay with it in a fine balance of consciousness and allow it to lead you and flow with it, then the Tao leads you through the path which is the most spontaneous and effortless. You do without doing. And so one of the formulations will be, the moment you start doing, then you have lost it. When you are not doing it, then you are doing. So it sounds contradictory when reduced to mental terms, but if you recognize that it's describing this subtle feel of the divine will, yes, that's what it is. It's the only way to describe it. So, follow the law it gives him and the assigned or revealed aim of his life and conduct. Now here it becomes much more specific to you. There is a law which you can see as a universal movement, of which there is an aspect which is yours, and then there is your aim in life, the work you have to do, which is unique to you. And again, at that level you cannot reduce it to mental forms and words. Often people start with this question, what is it that I have to do in my life? Shall I be a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer or an artist or a musician? No, that's not what the law is. That's not what your life's aim is. It's rather the movement of your soul wanting to grow in a certain relationship with the divine and experience and express something of that relationship. And this could happen whether you're a lawyer or a doctor or an artist. It could happen through any of those forms. But there may be a form which is much closer to the natural way in which it unfolds. Or, as it generally happens, there may be different forms at different stages of your growth in life. And that's why, in outer terms, your life is a zigzag. It seems to go exaggerated in one form, then corrects by exaggeration in another form. But throughout, the common thread is this deepening of the experience of expressing some aspect of the divine or growing in closeness to an aspect of the divine consciousness. So, assigned or revealed aim of his life. It feels as if I'm given this, or I discover, oh, this is how it was always. It's revealed, but I had already chosen it. There's no assignment, there's no push. But there are two different aspects of the experience. Now you see how every nuance and every word in this description is capturing a variation. And now if you take any of these separately, you will find entire religious traditions which focus on that. Religious traditions which say God has given to you, assigned to you a special role. Or some who will say, well, it's revealed from within, or He reveals from within. Or some will say, well, it's the natural law, it's the way you can truly be yourself and you flow with what you are. But they're just different formulations of something which is essentially the same. And raise himself towards the highest height that it demands of him in his life now or in his existence hereafter. So again, there are religions focused on the now, religions focused on the hereafter, and then those which cover both. But what is intended in this is this movement of raising towards the highest height that this revealed movement, aim of life, demands of him now and hereafter. And then the other side now, as if paralleling this approach in traditions which do not look at a cosmic self or spirit or creator. If there is no such universal or supreme spirit or being, he must know what there is. And so the Buddhist vocabulary will say there is only the emptiness of the nirvana. But what is the nature of the emptiness that you enter into? That cannot be described. It is not a hollow, but it is not a fullness. It is not this, and it can only speak of what it is not. But you can still discover and experience it. So he must know what there is. And knowing that, how to lift himself to it out of his present imperfection and impotence. If there is this emptiness and there is a nature of emptiness, well, how do I grow in closeness with it? And that begins the whole journey. And so he says this approach is the aim of religion. Its purpose is to link the human with the divine, and in so doing sublimate the thought and life and flesh, so that they may admit the rule of the soul and spirit. This sublimation, making more refined, more subtle, although of the same essential substance, losing grossness to acquire its true nature, so that it is now ready to admit the rule of the soul and the spirit. That which is above rules this and leads this. In one of the more occult traditions, but which veers towards religion and stays somewhere always oscillating between the two, is in the European tradition called the alchemical tradition. And it has a religious aspect. It even uses this vocabulary of sublimating. But the means are highly occult and often using strong symbolism of physical substances, turning iron or base metal into gold. And this is our body tissue, our human nature, which is iron. And when it becomes gold, it has the characteristic of divinity, and it responds only to soul and spirit. How is that done? Well, there are two components involved. The two components are again given elemental names. There is sulfur, there is mercury, which represent the Prakriti and the Purusha aspect. Both have to be purified, raised and united to make for the gold. So you see, essentially it is the yogic process that is described, but in such a vocabulary which seems to be almost like a chemical. What is interesting is, although in the inner or secret tradition of alchemy, the teaching is primarily spiritual, psycho-spiritual, because it uses vocabulary of material substance, or rather it uses vocabulary of material substance because it sees the material world as symbolic representation of the spiritual. And so literally the same formulas applied to materiality will cause a transmutation of iron into gold. But the ability to transmute involves your consciousness being sufficiently raised to be able to intervene along with the chemical process. So this much for religion, and you can see now the role of religion even as you see the role of occultism. In the very essence of the spiritual journey, as you grow in closeness to the divine and prepare yourself to become an instrument for the divine consciousness, the essential objectives of religion are included. And you may use religious means or not, that does not matter. Finally comes the aspect of spiritual philosophy, the aspect of mind, understanding, and this is what he deals with now. But this knowledge must be something more than a creed or a mystic revelation. His thinking mind must be able to accept it, to correlate it with the principle of things and the observed truth of the universe. This is the work of philosophy. And in the field of the truth of the spirit, it can only be done by a spiritual philosophy, whether intellectual in its method or intuitive. So, what is philosophy doing? It is correlating the principle of things and the observed truth of the universe. You see in the universe certain things happening. You look at certain principles. How do you link these two? That's the work of philosophy. So there is even a philosophy of science, which asks, why is science the way it is? What makes for it that science begins with conservation of energy, or conservation of momentum, or conservation of mass? Science itself will say, well, that's not our domain. We just know these are the laws. Philosophy says, yes, there must be conservation because there is one origin, and that one origin is unchanging. Because it is unchanging, whatever it expresses in the totality must be unchanging, while in the detail can change. Now all this is philosophical because the physics or science will say, sorry, that's speculation. We can never validate whether this is true or not. But philosophy says it makes sense, and it's the only way to understand and explain. So when philosophy tries to experience or understand the field of truth of spirit, it cannot be a mental and rational philosophy. It has to move to a higher grade, which he calls spiritual philosophy. because it has to deal with truths which are of spirit, not of matter. And to validate a truth of spirit requires already a supra-rational understanding. For example, truth of spirit is that the divine can never be angry. The only relation of the divine with the world is one of identity. And a relationship of identity can only give itself in love. Now, this is something which you can recognize once you glimpse the nature of the spiritual reality. But if you stop with a mentally created concept, there is a God sitting on a throne and he has ordered me to do this. If I don't do it, he will get angry. That is justified to the rational thinking. But it's not. It's a falsehood when seen from the position of the spiritual experience. And so a spiritual philosophy is what is needed. It cannot be done by an inferior grade of philosophy. And of this he says, whether intellectual in its method or intuitive. These are two different approaches to the spiritual philosophy. The method can be intellectual, but the origination cannot be the intellect. It can still rationally present, or it can present intuitively. It will say, well, the divine is pure love, and so this is how it is. And the intuition senses and says, yes, I can feel the truth of what you say. And you stop there. You don't understand why, but it's okay. You know, you feel. You will find when you read Sri Aurobindo's Savitri, there is this intuitive articulation of the spiritual philosophy. Broad portions where he actually describes why things are, how things are, and sometimes using rational terms, but the strength of it is not so much the rational, logical formulation, but the intuitive description of the philosophy. The same truth, when you read Sri Aurobindo in the Life Divine, is rationally justified. It cannot be otherwise because this, that, and the other. And the rational justification is so complete that you cannot find any counter argument that he has not already addressed. And yet, the experience of it held within you could slip through your fingers, through your mind, if you're too busy with the rational explanation. And he does not dilute that, that is also there. But because formulated through the rational vocabulary and structure, you can miss it. When you read Savitri, it's as if the rational formulation has been set aside and the same thing is described in purely intuitive formulation, but it has still the spiritual experience and the spiritual philosophy. And here you get a sense of the difference between the two approaches. So, what's the point of this? Why do we need to be able to understand and link this? He says, because this knowledge cannot be just a creed or a mystic revelation. You can't just say, here's the book God has revealed, now you have to follow it. Or, this is how your grandparents did it, this is how the ancients did it, now you have to stick with it. Unfortunately, so much of what is transmitted is kept on these levels. Wherever it is still creed or revealed formulation, you find the modern mind rejects. And this is the reason why many valuable traditions are breaking down and losing themselves. On the brink of being lost, often you have incarnations of individuals who will now try to bridge with rationality. To the extent that they can, the tradition can reformulate itself in a way that is understandable and survive or spread. But if it cannot, it seems as if to die down. If the inner force is strong enough, people will still come to it, but use it more as a lever for ascending or fill it with a different philosophy to use for its understanding. One such we see particularly in the Native American traditions. Because the formulation through mental means was never given too much importance in their culture. Even today it is looked down. Some of their great teachers will say, too many words, too much mind talk, stop this, just feel. And it's wonderful because what it can convey through that feeling is so deep and so great. But for someone who is not ready to feel, it's as if, what's the point of this? It doesn't make sense to me. And you literally see a collision of two different worlds. I've had occasion to meet a few individuals in that tradition who actually straddle the two worlds, but they even struggle with words and logical formulations. And I developed a very close relationship with one of the Native American leaders. He's not a chief, he says, he's a sun dancer. But in the way that I would articulate, he says, yes, that makes sense. That touches my heart. But without my compromising on the rational formulation. And so in our relationship over the years, it developed in a very beautiful way. I was able to help him to understand that other side of the rational formulation. And over the years I found, rather than him saying, I don't get it, he now says, yes, I am able to now cross over and bring people to his side. And so it's an interesting thing to see, but I have not had contact with too many of whom I can say this capacity is there. And I once said it to him. And I said to him, you're like a bridge. And he said, I get it, I get what you say. And I pointed to the other Native American leaders who were there, who could not straddle these two worlds. And I said, they are like the posts that support the bridge. They can't cross the two worlds, but they are there supporting the bridging movement. And so what is to be seen is, in such cases, what gift they have for the world in many of their practices are actually being taken by individuals, but without a rational component. So they go for their sweat lodges, they go for what they call journeys, or what the vocabularies they use for going into the forest for a few days to find your purpose and some kind of a self-discovery. So there are young people who do that as a practice. But behind it, there is no rational formulation of why or how or what is to be done. You just go, you experience, and then you come back with the experience into your world of reason, logic, or understanding of, or philosophy, or whatever form it is. So this knowledge must be something more than a creed or a mystic revelation. His thinking mind must be able to accept it, to correlate it with the principle of things and the observed truth of the universe. I see, this is what dharma is, this is how it operates, how does it link in between? That's the spiritual philosophy. There is such a thing as a divine will, but what does it mean for me to follow it? This is how it is. And now he comes to having shown the validity of the approach to the divine through occult, through religion, and through spiritual philosophy. He shows how these three have to flow into the fourth line of development. But all knowledge and endeavor can reach its fruition only if it is turned into experience and has become a part of the consciousness and its established operations. So whether you began with the occult experience or the religious formulations and practices or the spiritual philosophy in understanding, at some point it has to be turned into an experience that becomes a part of your consciousness and the normal working of your consciousness. An experience had in a special state and lost in your normal working is pointless, or at best can be like a reference for what you have to do. In the spiritual field, all this religious, occult or philosophical knowledge and endeavor must, to bear fruition, end in an opening up of the spiritual consciousness. in experiences that found and continually heighten, expand, and enrich that consciousness, and in the building of a life and action that is in conformity with the truth of the Spirit. This is the work of spiritual realization and experience. So let's look at each of these three: religion, occult, or philosophical knowledge. If it has to bear fruit in the spiritual field, then it has to end up in an opening up of the spiritual consciousness and in experiences that establish the spiritual consciousness and heighten, expand, and enrich that consciousness for life and action. This is the broad objective. So if, as a result of the occult knowledge, you're able to sense from now an awakened inner mind or an inner vital or inner perception, you're able to sense the divine presence. And as a result now, you're able to open to it and lift your consciousness. And in your activities in life, you're able to enter in relation with that presence in a movement of consecration. Then that occult awakening has become useful. If the occult knowledge is only in the shape of a formula, if I repeat this mantra so many times and throw these so many seeds on such and such a day at such and such a time, then I get a little bit of money. It's not changed my consciousness, it's not helped me enter in deeper relation with the divine. It has zero value for the spiritual field. Same with the religious. If it has not turned into this action and this change of consciousness, and with the philosophical knowledge. The philosophical knowledge equally, just the dwelling in thought on the idea that there is one immanent divine, is enough to begin to make a change, that you begin to perceive that immanence or that presence, and it becomes more and more concrete to you. Or the religious ritual leads to the state of exaltation, and in the state of exaltation at least you feel the truth of it, even if later you seem to lose it, but now you have a reference on which to build. So you see the justification for all these three. All of them help to make that first entry to go deeper inward in relation with the divine. But the goal he brings very clearly is this: an opening of the spiritual consciousness in experiences that found and continuously heighten and expand and enrich that consciousness. That means the consciousness is established more and more in your life. But whatever you receive first is not enough. It must grow in height and in wideness and in complexity and richness of possibilities. A flat monotone of a single experience is not enough. The growth aspect has three dimensions. Whatever you first experienced is at best a tail end of the true experience of the divine. So it has to keep heightening. Whatever you first experienced is a narrow front of contact of that which is infinite and eternal. And so it must expand. And whatever you have experienced is an aspect of something which is including all possibilities infinitely. And so you must be able to enter into the fullness of its rich, infinite potential. And all of this as experience should work towards building of a life and action that is in conformity with the truth of the Spirit. Right now, the life we have, the action we have is in conflict with the truth of the Spirit, because it is primarily driven by this little ego and its immediate movement of impulse, desire, habit. And the truth working from above can use this, but at every moment it has to nudge it, and the nudge is in a direction different from what it is. So while the human individual is busy chasing his desire, impulse, habit, that nudge comes in, nudges a bit here, a bit there, a bit there. And so bit by bit over time, as you chase your desire, you are led towards something higher. That's why it's the crooked path. When we grow in awareness of the divine, we feel the alignment, and the crooked path becomes less crooked and it becomes more and more direct. The linking principle which makes it most direct is the growing aspiration within us. It is Agni. And so there is the prayer, invocation to Agni in the Isha Upanishad, that the culmination where the prayer is, lead us from the crooked path to the direct path. And what is this Agni? The part of your consciousness that turns in aspiration towards the divine rises like a flame, and like a flame, because it is also illumined, knows the divine presence and touches or makes a first contact, and later draws down the descent of the divine consciousness and deepens the contact. And as we hold ourselves more and more centered in the aspiration, we feel when we are off track, because the aspiration knows the truth. It is described as Jata Vedas, born with the knowledge, carrying the true knowledge, and every time we do something misaligned with the aspiration, we feel something is not okay, and we can correct it. So within us, there is already this center which can lead through, but eventually all means used should lead to this life and action that is in conformity with the truth of the Spirit. This is the work of the spiritual realization and experience. And so you see how these three flow into the fourth. The fourth completes these three lines, and nature has been pushing humanity or human development or the spiritual awakening in all four broad lines. Now Sri Aurobindo takes up each of these four lines and shows you what nature has done so far in these. In other words, where we have come to in the development through each of these four. And what will be interesting as we study this is that we will see a historical perspective and a rationale of why nature used this or that method or correction. But also it will make obvious to us what we need to do now in these four aspects of our being, because all four are part of our spiritual awakening. But first, the common element to all four is the fact that they unfold slowly. So the next paragraph, which we will take up next Sunday, begins like this. In the very nature of things, all evolution must proceed at first by a slow unfolding. For each new principle that evolves its powers has to make its way out of an involution in inconscience and ignorance. It has a difficult task in pulling itself out of the involution. So we will see how each of these four lines of development has struggled first to pull itself out of the involved state, and then how it turns towards the higher. So we can pause here for today, and looking back now, we see these four movements which are as if four entry points for us to the inner realms of the spirit and the soul. All four represent aspects of our relationship with the divine. All four are actually simultaneously present, even if we don't distinguish between them. And it is this which will lead us to the most complete knowledge of the divine and the complete expression of the divine consciousness in life. We can meditate on this for a few minutes.